You're listening to The Greater Loop, a podcast from the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. In each episode, we bring to you leaders who connect Houston to the world, from business to diplomacy, innovation to impact. This is where global conversation begins. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to The Greater Loop, a podcast of the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. My name is Maryanne Maldonado, and today we're discussing the escalating tensions involving the United States, Israel, and Iran, a situation that is having enormous regional and global implications. Joining us today is Mona Yacoubian, Director of the Middle East Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mona is one of the leading experts on regional security and conflicts in the Middle East. And Mona, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Maryanne.
Certainly. Well, let's set the stage for our listeners. Can you briefly explain what triggered this round of attacks and how we arrived at this moment? Why now?
So the war comes on the heels of months of rising tensions between the United States and Iran. And we've seen a back and forth between the threat of the outbreak of violence and conflict and negotiations. And so most recently, following significant protests in Iran in January that were met by brutal repression, President Trump warned that the United States could resort to military action as a way of addressing Iran's repressive behavior and practices. So most recently, there were negotiations between the United States and Iran. They were mediated by the Omani government. And the negotiations were an attempt to see if the U.S. and Iran could reach a deal, ostensibly on Iran's nuclear program. The talks broke down, and very soon after, conflict broke out. The United States and Israel together launched a wide array of strikes on Iran, targeting its nuclear facilities, its ballistic missile facilities, and of course, also regime leadership, including killing the supreme leader of Iran and 40 or more senior leaders in the Iranian military and security structure.
Were you surprised when we learned that we had taken out 40 of the senior leaders within the country?
I was a bit surprised, Maryanne, because honestly, there had been a number of goals and objectives laid down at varying times by President Trump and other senior officials in the administration. And these goals ranged from curtailing Iran's nuclear program, as I noted, all the way to regime change in Iran. But never was there clarity on exactly what goals and objectives prompted the military confrontation to begin when it did. And so there's this whole question of whether there was an imminent threat posed by Iran, or was this in fact an effort at regime change? And within 24 hours of the conflict starting, of course, it was announced that the supreme leader and these large number of other leaders had been killed. And so that, I think, is a bit surprising because it quickly seemed to have morphed from more limited objectives around Iran's nuclear program to something that's more akin to regime change.
And so you really think future objectives, strategic objectives are around that regime change totality?
Well, here's the tricky part, is that when you listen to senior officials speaking now, like in the last few days, they back away from the idea that this is regime change. So, for example, Secretary of War Hegseth just a couple days ago said, this is not a regime change war, but the regime has changed. And so that kind of raises some big questions about, again, this lack of clarity of what exactly are we doing? What exactly is the focus of this conflict? And I think that, to be honest, I think the ghost of previous efforts at regime change in the Middle East hangs over this. And I think this is an administration that was elected on promises that there would be no more forever wars in the Middle East. And so I think you're seeing a bit of a shift in the messaging in terms of what the objectives are. So now we are really seeing this being presented as more addressing what was a more imminent threat with respect to Iran's missile capabilities and potentially Iran's nuclear ambitions. But there again, there's not a lot of evidence or intelligence reporting that actually backs up those claims.
We see all the reports on the television. What are the people, the citizens of Iran on the ground? You see some celebrating, you see others mourning. What is your sense of the on-the-ground feel?
Well, let's be clear. There has been an internet shutdown in Iran for the past several days. So the first point to make on that is information coming out of Iran is not super accurate or clear. We do have anecdotal reporting of both some Iranians who have been celebrating the killing of Ayatollah Khamenei and who are looking for this as a moment of real change in Iran. You have other reports and video of Iranians who were mourning the death of the supreme leader. At the end of the day, I think Iranians, frankly, are increasingly concerned about the trajectory of this conflict and with it, where their country is going. So the most recent reporting from reporters that have contacts on the ground in Iran is suggesting that folks are worried, they're concerned, and there's a lot of uncertainty about where things are going.
And certainly we now know that as many as 6 or more other country sites have been hit. What does it tell us about the other regional actors in the region, the Gulf states, even the Hezbollah, Iran-backed people and groups?
I mean, Maryanne, the geographic spread of this conflict over less than a week is astounding. I've been tracking every day how this conflict is spreading geographically beyond the original protagonists of Israel, of course, because Israel's in the region, and Iran. And you're right to note that pretty much within 24 hours, Iran undertook retaliatory attacks against all of the Gulf states. But it goes well beyond that. We have attacks now as far as Azerbaijan. Iran targeted Azerbaijan today. We have the U.S. also, though, responding, hitting an Iranian ship with a torpedo off the coast of Sri Lanka. So the spread of this is significant. And you mentioned Lebanon, and I'm glad you did, because actually that has now constituted a second front that has opened up in this war. And that happened because among the different tactics Iran has used, they started to leverage their proxy groups against Israel. And in this case, the Lebanese Shiite militia Hezbollah, which 2 or 3 days into this conflict launched rocket and drone strikes against northern Israel. That brought on a very swift and very muscular offensive by Israel, really now embroiling much of Lebanon in a war, such that today the southern third of the country is under evacuation orders. And tens of thousands of people have now been displaced. And there are also Israeli strikes on Beirut, specifically the Hezbollah-dominated southern suburbs of Beirut. So it is an incredibly tense moment in Lebanon, as well as it becomes now part of what is this widening conflict in the region.
We've heard that within the first, hours of this attack, that we had accomplished a large amount of our initiative. In your assessment, where do you see it currently?
Yes, you're absolutely right. There have been, significant reports from CENTCOM, the military command that's leading this offensive, has said that we are close to, if not already having achieved, superiority or air dominance, so control over Iran's skies. It's estimated that there have been some 3,600 U.S. and Israeli strikes all across Iran, hitting a variety of targets. So regime-related targets, ballistic missile-related targets, nuclear-related targets, and then other key strategic security and military targets. I think the big question, Maryanne, going forward is really going to be how much of Iran's ballistic missile capability has been taken out. That, to my mind, is the key factor that's going to determine how long this war will go on. And to be honest, we don't know the answer to that question.
How has this moment affected kind of U.S. credibility and relationships with our Middle Eastern friends?
That is such a good question. And I think the jury is a bit out, okay? Because prior to the outbreak of conflict, of course, there was this drama behind the scenes of a number of Gulf actors, in particular, I would say Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Oman, the mediating country, really pressing upon President Trump and his administration not to go to war with Iran for fear of exactly what we're watching, which for these countries is a nightmare scenario. They have been, their civilian infrastructure has been hit. Their energy infrastructure has been hit. There is enormous disruption in the region. We should also remember it's Ramadan, a holy month in the Muslim world, and they are breaking their fast with concerns about drone and missile strikes on their countries. And so, on the one hand, of course, Iran is a threat to these countries, and they are no friend of Iran. But on the other hand, there's real concern about this conflict, which I think from the perspective of the Gulf countries in particular, feels like it is spiraling out of control. And central to all of this is the role of the United States, and whether the United States can serve that role of security guarantor for the Gulf. And we are seeing the U.S. play an important role. It is, of course, our THAAD missile interceptors that are helping these countries to intercept some of these missile and drone strikes. But of course, we see that a number of them are also getting through. And so ultimately, how the region views the United States, Maryanne, is very much going to depend on the duration and the outcome of this conflict.
What would we see as the indicators for stabilization during a conflict?
Well, I think that question I raised earlier about ballistic missile stocks, do we start to see a real decrease in Iran's ballistic missile strikes? And we are starting to see a slower volume of ballistic missile strikes, especially against Israel. That would be one indicator. Okay, maybe this is starting to calm down. Another indicator would be, are there back-channel discussions? There was some news reporting that the Iranians had reached out to the Trump administration and the Trump administration might have spoken to them, but those news reports have now been disavowed and denied. My sense is there probably will be some back-channel quiet conversations going on about how to de-escalate this conflict. I think the key that's going to be, though, difficult to think through is Iran's drone capabilities, because Iran is able to manufacture thousands of drones a month. They're cheap and they can be very disruptive, and they're very hard to shoot down because there's so many of them. And so as long as those drones are flying, I'm afraid we are going to see some level of disruption and some level of, obviously, concern in the region and really an inability to return to normal.
Mona, have you seen a response from other European countries?
Well, I think there's a big difference, between the UN and Europe. I mean, we're not seeing the UN really play a role. And I think that's deeply concerning, when we think about bigger questions about the international order and organizations like the UN, which are charged with, ensuring that there are rules that are, respected. in that regard, this was not a war that was undertaken through a UN Security Council resolution, et cetera. So you're seeing the UN play a very limited role, with the exception maybe of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA. That's the agency that's charged with overseeing Iran's nuclear capabilities. And so whenever the dust does settle, hopefully soon, they will be charged with ensuring whatever is agreed to with respect to Iran's nuclear program. The Europeans are honestly quite confused, I think, about how to manage this. So you have a bit of a controversy that erupted in Great Britain when the British Prime Minister initially did not allow the U.S. to use the British bases like at Diego Garcia and other places. That caused an uproar with the United States. They then did allow the U.S. to use those bases and I think quietly are supporting us. But this is also controversial from the other side in Great Britain. And I didn't mention this, but there was a British military base in Cyprus that was hit by Iran.
I didn't know that.
Yes, also because of Britain's support. And so you have the Brits on the one hand, and then you have the Spanish, who are saying they're completely opposed to this and want nothing to do with it and are criticizing the United States. So you have a wide range of responses.
And for us here at home, for American audiences, trying to make sense of all this complexity, it's such a moment of complexity. So many actors, so many states involved, so many countries involved. What's the most important thing that we should understand about what's happening right now?
We should understand is that this conflict is going to have reverberations across the region and globally for the coming weeks or months. And by that, I mean, we're seeing already, even, for example, we were talking before we started, prices ticking up at the gas pump. Unfortunately, I think that's going to continue until we see things stabilize. That's going to also have an effect on overall inflation, on the willingness, for example, of the Fed to reduce interest rates. All of these things are connected. We're starting to see more impacts on shipping, for example, as well, even the availability of fertilizer. So you can see there are multiple knock-on effects. That's the immediate concern that I think Americans feel in their everyday lives. More broadly, I think we need to understand what's happening between the United States and Iran against a much broader context of what I call a hinge moment in the Middle East. And I've been writing and thinking about this for quite some time. And by hinge moment, I mean we are really watching the collapse of an old order and the emergence of a new one that has yet to completely form. I think we should understand this conflict with Iran and what happens in Iran. Does the Islamic Republic survive? Or is there a regime collapse in Iran? Or regime change to something else? Given how central Iran is in the Middle East, that is going to be a defining question for how the region evolves over the coming years. So we're talking about immediate effects, literally today, tomorrow, next month at the gas pump. But we're also talking about something that is going to reverberate for months, if not years.
Mona, thank you for helping us unpack such a complicated situation. And thanks to our listeners for joining us. I hope you'll stay tuned for other great Greater Loop programs in the future. Thank you again, Mona.
Thank you so much, Maryanne. I enjoyed the conversation.